So I'm going to start this morning with a koan. And my plan is to eventually find my way back to cultural appropriation. We'll see whether I can succeed at doing that. Now, this particular koan, well, let's start. Let's acknowledge today is what? The spring equinox. A very exciting event in my estimation, in my life. A sign that within the next 60 to 90 days, we'll have spring in Maine. So always welcome. And this is a koan that I like to talk on in the spring. So even though I don't know what it is now, I think it's like 30, even though it's 38 degrees out right now, or whatever it is, I'm going to read this spring koan. Changsha, wandering in the mountains. One day, Changsha went wandering in the mountains. Upon returning, he got to the gate. When he got to the gate, the head monk asked, "Where are you coming from, master?" Shah said, "From wandering in the mountains." The monk asked, "Where did you go?" Shah said, "First I went pursuing the fragrant grasses. Then I returned, following the falling flowers." The head monk said, "How very much like the sense of springtime." Shah said, "It even surpasses the autumn dew dripping on the lotuses." Suetu added the remark, "Thanks for your reply." Okay, I'll read that again. One day, Changsha went wandering in the mountains. Upon returning, when he got to the gate, the head monk asked, "Where are you coming from, master?" Shah said, "From wandering in the mountains." The head monk asked, "Where did you go?" Shah said, "First I went pursuing the fragrant grasses. Then I returned following the falling flowers." The head monk said, "How very much like the sense of springtime." Shah said, "It even surpasses the autumn dew dripping on the lotuses." Sueto added the remark, "Thanks for your reply." This is a beautiful, very evocative koan in terms of the images that it offers us. Wandering, you know, term that's here. Wandering is a lost art. In fact, Susan probably knows this from her courses with Rob, but one of the things that we teach when we're trying to teach people to experience nature intimately is to wander, to be out there with no particular goal, with no purpose, not to log 5 miles today, not to bag the 49th peak, not to take the quintessential nature photo, but just to wander. You know, we are so purposeful as human beings these days that we don't know how to do that anymore. We don't know how to wander. And here's Changsha returning from wandering in the mountains. Very significant, because this can be understood on several levels. But on the most basic level, it's just that he's out there with no purpose, with no destination. And therefore, he is completely free. He's unbound by concepts and thought structures and objects and goals and gaining and losing and all of those things. He is free of them. He is just wandering. Where did you go? First, I went pursuing the fragrant grasses. Then I returned following the falling flowers. So that could sound maybe like he had some purpose, but I don't think it says that. I think it says he's just being carried by the day, being carried by the springtime. His feet taking him wherever his heart is drawn. So what Changsha is pointing to in this koan, again, is tremendous freedom. And undoubtedly, he doesn't only experience that freedom when he goes for a walk in the mountains, but in every moment of his life. He is just living fully, allowing himself to be drawn in whatever way he needs to be drawn in that moment, responding in whatever way he needs to respond in that moment. And in that sense, Changsha is tremendously free. Now, a student kind of catches him up here a little bit, the head monk, and says, well, how very much like the sense of springtime. So here's Changsha talking about going with the flowers and the falling leaves and so on, falling petals. And so the student is kind of, maybe you're a little bit attached to this whole thing. You know, maybe the springtime has a little bit of a hold on you. And Changsha replies, it even surpasses the autumn dew dripping on the lotuses. Clear and cold. Clear and cold. So for Changsha, he's not being drawn in by these things, but he's experiencing them with a cool clarity. Cool clarity. That's a very subtle thing. It's very hard, anybody has ever tried this, not to get attached to springtime. Right, a couple of days ago, it was 60 degrees and it was sunny here. I don't know, you're all scattered around the world. Arizona, it gets 60 and sunny, you put your winter coats on, I know. So, but anyway, here in Maine, that's like a pretty wonderful day. It's about a month at least early to be out, and you go out on a day like that and you feel the warm sun and everything is melting. We still have quite a bit of snow here. So we're not seeing any green grass or buds, things popping up through the ground, but we're seeing them, at least we're seeing the melting snow and now the dead leaves coming back. And it's just, how difficult it is not to attach. Go, oh, spring is wonderful. Winter is bad. Oh, I'm not going to like it when fall comes again. It's going to get cold. Those are all manifestations of attachment. And to some extent, I would argue that it's impossible not to attach somewhat to spring if you've just been through a New England winter. Yeah, those of you who live in warm places, you should come here just to have this wonderful experience that we have here in Maine. A couple of feet of snow, sub-zero nights. Really much like the lotuses. But anyway, so how do we not attach to it? I think probably we do, almost cannot avoid it. It's very hard sometimes to have that perfect freedom that Changsha has. And yet I also think there's sort of a middle way, that it's possible to enjoy and appreciate the springtime and not attach to it. Spring, as all things, is subject to impermanence. It comes and it will go. It will go remarkably fast. You know, we'll kind of turn our heads and suddenly it'll be, oh God, it's too hot. It's summer, you know, it's drought. It's, you know, and all that wonder of the fresh greenness of spring will be gone. So the question is, can we live fully and appreciate spring and not attach? We know that impermanence is an inviolable law, right? We know that. We know that just as sure as the spring comes, the spring goes. And that's true of absolutely everything in life. This was one of the Buddha's most fundamental teachings about impermanence. So can we walk that middle way of being fully immersed in springtime, of appreciating springtime, and of not attaching? Now I'm saying springtime, but it could be anything in our lives, right? Anything. Can we simultaneously have that coolness that Changsha is talking about? And that's a subtle and tricky thing, isn't it? But in theory, at least, if we're living in that way, then spring comes, ha, wonderful. Summer comes, ha, wonderful. Autumn comes, ha, wonderful. Winter comes, wonderful, right? We're experiencing everything without attaching, and without judging, without forming our personal ways of clinging and resisting impermanence. Living freely, beautiful. One day, Changsha went wandering in the mountains. Upon returning, when he got to the gate, the head monk asked, "Where are you coming from, master?" Sha said, "From wandering in the mountains." The monk asked, "Where did you go?" Sha said, "First I went pursuing the fragrant grasses. Then I returned, following the falling flowers." The head monk said, "How very much like the sense of springtime." Sha said, "It even surpasses the autumn dew dripping on the lotuses." Swaytu added the remark. "Thanks for your reply." So what else does this remind us of? To me, I draw the connection to the Zen peacemaker order model that begins with not knowing. Not knowing is another way of expressing what Changsha is expressing. Not knowing is also a great sense of freedom, of not grasping, not pulling in, not pushing away, but just allowing. Not knowing is allowing. It's not controlling. It's not owning. It's allowing. So in that model, that's where we start, not knowing. However smart we may be and however much knowledge we have, it's irrelevant. We face the moment with a blank screen, ready to receive whatever is there. And that not knowing is the precondition of bearing witness, right? Of seeing very accurately. Because we're not seeing through the filter of our prejudices, our preconceptions. Our prior experiences. We're seeing just what's there. And then the third part is responding with loving kindness, right? In that model. We've talked about that model before. It's beautiful. It's very simple. It is the actualization of our way in our lives. So this is where I'm coming around the barn to the discussion about cultural appropriation. Believe it or not. And thank you, Deirdre, for putting up that link to Brad's talk. I don't know if any people listened to that, but some did. Anyway. So part of the context, part of the lens that I see this through, that's kind of impacted my view on this, is a documentary called Fighting Indians. Anybody seen Fighting Indians? No? It was made here in Maine, and it premiered, I don't know, a couple of years ago prior to COVID, because I was able to see the premiere. And it was made in the world-renowned community of Skowhegan, Maine. But by two documentary filmmakers. And the context is that, as many of you know, as of 2019, it became illegal in the state of Maine to have an Indigenous American mascot for a sports team. And most of the schools in the state complied with that promptly and without much fuss. But Skowhegan was the holdout. They fought kicking and screaming till the very end. And what this movie shows, this documentary shows, is excerpts from a series of meetings between the townspeople of Skowhegan and representatives of the various Wabanaki tribes who came to Skowhegan particularly to have this dialogue, to try to help the people of Skowhegan understand why they were upset. And if I think this could be, I haven't did an attempt to access it online, but I'm pretty sure that you can find it. And it's quite interesting. And one of the things that's interesting about it is just what we're talking about here. So there's the opposite of not knowing, of knowing, you know. And so you had people from Skowhegan saying, you know, they had this fighting Indian that was their mascot image, the typical stereotypical thing with feathers and a hatchet or something. And they're saying, that's our heritage. You're taking away our heritage. And you had the people from the Waban, you know, which just, when you see it, it's like, what? That's your heritage? And on the other hand, you had the Wabanaki people saying, wait a minute, this is deeply offensive to us. This hurts us because it's a stereotype. It's not an accurate view of who we are or what we are. It just totally dismisses us. And so the two sides really were at an impasse, because you had people in Skowhegan that were very angry, because for generations their basketball team had gone onto the floor with that warrior token. And conversely, I mean, the Wabanaki people that spoke were very, very calm by comparison, but clearly deeply, deeply feeling a wounding. And the other piece of context here is Skowhegan is right next to Norridgewock. And probably people don't know, but Norridgewock was the site of a massacre where many Wabanaki people, women, children, old people, and so on, were just cut down by the settlers. It was very brutal. So that Skowhegan being so close to the site of that massacre made it even more emotionally charged for the Wabanaki. And so what we see in this thing, in this situation, but in all situations where we're talking about cultural appropriation, is we have two perspectives, at least two perspectives. And people, if they are entering a room for a discussion, they're each, you know, each side is entering with its perception, its history. You know, and so this is sort of, to some extent, the antithesis of this not knowing. Of this state of freedom. It's the exact opposite of freedom. You know, it's attachment that in some cases generated real anger. Nasty things were said. And I don't know, now we're a few years later, I don't know where things stand there now, but I suspect it won't heal for at least a generation in that community. The feelings ran so deep. And the people of Skowhegan were so offended that they were being told that their mascot wasn't appropriate. And again, from an outside perspective, maybe that sounds absurd, but in terms of that community, it was not absurd. It was very real. And so we see these things all the time, right? These days, if we're sensitive to and aware of instances of cultural appropriation. And I brought this up not so much because last week, or when I brought it up, not so much because I have a particular stand on this, but because I think it's constantly worthwhile asking questions and examining our perspectives. Are we coming from the place of not knowing? Are we coming from a place of openness where we can freely bear witness? Or are we coming from a place of some, I say the word, I want to say the word prejudice. If I say the word prejudice, maybe that's too strong. Maybe it's not, we think, people say, oh, I'm not prejudiced. Prejudice is a strong word. But from some attachment, some view, some perspective that we hold, that is not being open, that is not listening in the same way that many of the people in Skowhegan could not listen to the Wabanaki. They could not hear what they were saying because they were so strongly attached to the notion that it was important that their team retain this Indian figure as their symbol. I think it's so important that we always be willing to examine our perspectives, that we always be willing to step back to that place of not knowing, that we always be willing to hear the discussion with fresh eyes, fresh ears. And in the case of cultural appropriation, to always be willing to hear the people whose culture is being appropriated. What the people in Skowhegan were saying is, we don't intend to offend anybody, therefore what we're doing is not offensive. And I'm not picking on the people of Skowhegan here. That's just such a natural reaction. I don't mean to be offensive. I don't mean to slight anybody. Therefore, I'm not offensive or slighting anybody. And yet, our intention is not the whole story. So it's so important that we be willing to not know and to hear and bear witness before we come to a judgment. And then the final piece is, as Buddhists, I think our job is to respond with loving kindness, if that's possible. If we're going to err, let's err on the side of loving kindness and compassion. If we're going to give somebody the benefit of the doubt, let's give them that benefit of the doubt. If I, as a Western person raised in a Eurocentric country, say, I don't think there's anything offensive about what we're doing with Buddhism, I think I've missed the point. It's not what I think we're doing with Buddhism we're not doing. It's what the people from whose cultures these practices arise feel and think about it. Now, there are always going to be differences of opinion, right? Always, this is, even in Skowhegan, there were differences of opinion. There were Skowhegan residents who were out there saying, we really do need to get rid of this. We really need, we really realize that we are, being offensive and hurting the feelings of our indigenous neighbors. Wasn't a universal opinion. Right? And the same the other way, it's like you could, who do you ask? I'm sure that if we interviewed 1,000 different Japanese people, we might get 1,000 different perspectives on, what it means to have Americans practicing Zen, ranging from people who would say, Brad talks about this a little, this was brought here by Japanese teachers originally, by Japanese Buddhists who felt that it was important to seed Zen in the West, that the world would benefit from there being Western Buddhists. They came here, our own Maizumi Roshi, Suzuki Roshi, Katagiri Roshi. These Japanese teachers came here intentionally to bring Zen to the West. And so one argument, and it's at least part of the argument that Brad makes, is, hey, it's here because Asian people wanted it to be here. And I think that's a perfectly legitimate and defensible argument. But at the same time, I think we could find other Asian people who would say they're very offended. For a number of years, I was the Buddhist chaplain for the Riverview Psychiatric Center here in Maine, the state psychiatric hospital. And so periodically, the primary chaplain, who was a Christian chaplain, would call me in when there were patients who identified as Buddhists or had questions about Buddhism. And one time I got called in because a man from, it's been a while, South Asia, Cambodia or Thailand, I'm not remembering which one exactly, was requesting to talk to a Buddhist priest. And so Chaplain James called me up and so, yep, I came over and went to the hospital and went into this little room to meet with this guy. And I could see he was totally confused. Like, who are you? And I could, and I said, well, I'm the Buddhist priest. And I could see absolute disbelief. I did not look like a Buddhist priest. Right? Because here I am, this white American guy. And in his mind, Buddhist priests are Asian, probably specific even to the culture that he was from. So it's kind of interesting, huh? So there will be clearly Asians who may be offended by Westerners taking up Buddhist practices that were, in their minds, have been practiced for many generations in their culture and their families. So whose voice do we listen to? What's the right answer here? I don't know. What I feel my responsibility is, and perhaps more broadly, our responsibility as Buddhists, is to ask the question, to periodically examine the issue, to be aware of what's out there. Right now, Asian Americans are experiencing terrible violence and discrimination. Right? This whole insanity that somehow, because the coronavirus developed in Wuhan, Asian people are at fault. So I imagine there's a lot of sensitive toes out there in the Asian American community right now about how Asian Americans are perceived and respected and treated. I think those are the kinds of things we always need to be sensitive to. We can't say, well, my intentions are good. we can't say it. I don't feel that I can say, my intentions are good. I don't mean to hurt anybody. So if you Asians or Americans are feeling a little touchy right now, that's your problem. But that's often what we do, especially, the dominant culture, those of us that are affiliated with the dominant culture, we can really, 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 totally innocently and inadvertently be very disrespectful of people from minority cultures. So I think we always have that responsibility to pay attention, to not know, to bear witness, and to respond with loving kindness.
Peter, your first of all, I would just say that was so spot on. That was such a great, the cultural appropriation argument can go in circles endlessly. So I think tying it to the Zen Peacemaker 3 tenets, yeah, I mean, that really resonated with me, very effective, because yeah, I too have really struggled with a lot of those questions. But what I was also thinking of as you were talking was, someone who is in higher education, so many, there's so much debate about how to have debate, right? Around a lot of similar kinds of issues, very, very difficult issues. And trying to figure out, is the debate itself harmful? Should we not have it? Should people be silenced or feel, open to be able to express how things are landing with them? And so much of what you said, I just really wanted to just bottle it up and bring it to some of the hard conversations we've even had at the law school. And in fact, this week in our class, we're teaching the concept of cultural humility. And I don't know if people are familiar with that. It's sort of an alternative to cultural competency, and really the core of cultural humility is these 3 tenets, even though they don't frame it that way. The first one being not knowing, right? That's humility, and just acknowledging that, you will always be in a state of not knowing, right? And bearing witness and being open to other people's experiences. And then of course, always responding with compassion. And when you are when you're serving in our context, we're talking about helping and serving people from other cultures, whatever that those other cultures should be. And we have brought to our classes this notion of brave spaces, and to be able to have conversations and explore difficult issues. And the question of intent, as you talked about, Peter, is so important to that, which is, your intention in saying things is not irrelevant, but it's also not the end of things. And recognizing that regardless of your intention, your words may have an impact on others. I think being open and recognizing and acknowledging that, and not sort of constantly going to, well, I didn't mean to offend. So anyway, so those are just a few thoughts that I have about just really how central those 3 practices are to really our engagement in the world, particularly our engagement with people who have different life experiences and different cultures. So again, really thank you for that.
Well, thank you for sharing. Thank you for enduring academia. These are, that's why so many people in this country are shutting down these days, right? Because these are hard conversations. And sometimes we are just chasing our tails, and and sometimes we're finding out that we did things that were hurtful or insensitive or thoughtless when, we had good intentions, and so it's hard stuff. It's hard stuff, but I think if we say that we are Zen practitioners and taking responsibility for our lives in the way that Zen asks us to, then I think we have some responsibility to get messy, get the mud on us, and make mistakes, right? We do that. We all make mistakes. And there are probably very few right answers. And maybe the answer is the process.
One thing that comes to mind for me is a pretty extreme example of the difference between thinking we know and not paying attention to the others is Vladimir Putin, from commentators I've read, basically thinks he knows that Ukraine is really just part of Russia. And because he knows this and doesn't care at all about the suffering of the people who are being bombed and stuff, he pays no attention whatsoever to any of that. He just thinks he knows that Ukraine is part of Russia. And that's why this is happening, so it seems like a pretty extreme example.
It is, but it's relevant, it's relevant. The narcissist is the most extreme example of this kind of whole phenomenon, right?
Beings. Oh, sorry.
Oh. No, go ahead, whoever is speaking, please.
Oh, it's me, Melissa. Attached to our preconceived ideas. That's, obviously that's the source of the friction and cultural appropriation. But we tend to accept ideas and information that confirms what we already believe, and we're very resistant to things that don't confirm that what we already believe, and that's just kind of true on so many levels. I mean, including things like accepting climate change, accepting cultural differences. It just permeates really the way I think our brains work. And being aware of, Zen helps me, and I hope all of us, to be aware of that those preconceived ideas are more fluid, that can be more fluid, and being open to that. And that's one thing. I love the idea of being open-minded, whatever that means, but it somehow helps to know that other people believe in that principle too. And keeping that alive is sometimes hard in this culture, I think. I just want to say one other thing is about the koan. I never thought of myself as attached to nature before, but I guess I am. And I'm not sure that's bad or good or whatever. I guess it gives me a different perspective on the way I connect to nature. So thank you for that.
Thank you. Yeah, that goes to the other issue raised by the koan, by this whole discussion, that part of the discussion about spring. Like, how unattached do we want to be? How important is perfect equanimity versus some degree of attachment that allows us to live in this world in a meaningful way? I think this is probably one of the most fundamental questions for 21st century Buddhism. I don't see it being addressed. Maybe it is, but I just haven't encountered it. You know, we can talk about it again in the context. Many of us are parents or partners, you know, but we have people in our lives that are important to us, right? And I think it would be hard to say that we don't have any attachment to those relationships. And you brought up the point, is it desirable? Melissa, you kind of alluded to that. Is it, you know, would it be desirable to have no attachment in the relationships with our immediate family members, with the people that we love? What would that look like? I'm not sure. It would probably make us pretty lousy partners or parents, or, you know, I think. And so maybe these things have degrees. You know, that's that story of Wohl, the Korean story. Did we read that here, Gary? Yeah, yeah. Who's crying at her granddaughter's death. She's not showing some kind of perfect detachment. Oh, my grandmother died. No, my granddaughter died. No big deal. No, she's shedding tears. So I don't have a good answer on that one, but there's another one of these things that I think it's really a vital question. What does it mean to be a householder, to live in the world, to have relationships, and to have some degree of non-attachment? And what degree is correct, if there's such a thing?
So there's a part of this that's that keeps coming back for me, which is that this cultural appropriation thing, there's another side to it, which is that everything is fluid. And this is related to relationships and love and attachment versus seeing the morphing and fluidity of it. So when I walk in the woods, I feel that I am relating to the Native Americans who walked this woods. And as a Jew, I feel all of the interdigitations of my cultural story with the Zen story and with the Native American story. And so I'm afraid that it's kind of hard to describe this, but I'm afraid that if we attach ourselves to this idea of, are we appropriating other cultures, we're losing the beauty of the fluidity that we are mixing and immersing and morphing. And so the Zen that's here is not the same Zen. And yes, I can understand that somebody seeing you as the Zen priest or whatever could be very disorienting for him, for sure, absolutely. And for me, it was very disorienting to see Reform Judaism when I was an Orthodox Jew. It was like, well, that's not the real thing. What the hell? But it's all morphing, and it's important that it's morphing because we are witnessing um, creation. We're witnessing a combining of different currents. So I agree we have to be sensitive, but I'm afraid that if we categorize different particular cultures as distinct, it's important. I'm not saying it's not important. And I do think listening and hearing and seeing how it impacts people is important. But I also think it's important to not shy away from the mixings, and what emerges from the mixings that is a valid emerging of a new culture, different new cultures. So it's kind of hard to describe that, but that's kind of related to the idea of being attached or not attached to your beloved, because there's a way in which
He's rolling his eyes. I can see.
I know. I'm sorry, and I'm sorry,
You're
everybody.
on thin ice now, Deborah. Be
it's-
careful.
But it's because because the magic of that is that you don't want to lose your beloved, but you're also interdigitated. We're interdigitated. We're impacted. It's related to the whole. It's related to the whole thing of life and death, and it's life and death of cultures. They're not dying; they're morphing. So how we can respect identities, but also not shy away from the new combinations, the newborn that then grows. The newborn is a combination of predecessors, but emerges as a new. I feel very strongly about this in terms of Judaism, for instance, combined with Zen, combined with Native American, that I see as a melting, merging. So it's honoring the ability to intermerge rather than worrying so much about continuing to make the distinctions. The distinctions matter, but so does the new mix. And that's life and death. Just saying.
Well, you're saying something very important, and I'm kind of wrestling with that as you're talking about it. And I think maybe the difference is what we do at a personal level and what we do at a broader socio-cultural level. And I'm just speculating here. For example, I'll make a personal example here from my life. I was given the honor of being made a pipe carrier by a Blackfoot Lakota elder. And I have a sacred pipe that I use from time to time. And I never take that pipe out in public because that would be offensive to some people, you know. They would say, you know, you're not an Indigenous American, you don't have a right to own, not own is not the word, because you never own the pipe, to hold and smoke the pipe. You know, and so I'm trying, I try to kind of walk between those two things. Like in my personal life, yes, that gets integrated into my spirituality, into my life. And yet it's not something I would carry out into public, you know, because I knew that would offend, annoy, hurt some people. Is that, I don't know, that makes any sense.
So, but your presence in being here with us is related to that pipe. But so I understand that you are afraid that it could not be heard and understood as the truth that it is, because it's a symbol. But it's essential for us. What you bring is essential, and it's related to that pipe. And that's kind of how I feel about, so for each of us to be, we don't want to be so distinguishing that we miss the pipe. I mean, that's interesting. It's a big deal.
I'm just reminded of this, Late Night with Seth Meyers. There's this segment called Jokes Seth Can't Tell. And so he brings out some of his they brings out some of his writers who are who maybe wrote the jokes, and that they're Black females and they could say those jokes, but they can't, but Seth can't tell them because, it would be offensive. It does, it's just the way it is. I mean, but they, of course, they want the jokes to be told, the writers, so they bring out somebody who can tell them. I just think that's kind of symbolic of a lot of things in our culture. I was walking the dog at the dog park, and there was these black men and boys playing basketball next to the dog park, and they're just nigger this, nigger that, and I think, oh, gosh, that's not something I could never say that, and that I don't want to say that really, but just that's another form of cultural appropriation, the way they can use that word and the way I can't. So.
Well, again, I think it comes to the question of, is somebody being hurt? Is somebody being offended? And context, right? That use of the language is in a context of 600 years of oppression. Somebody didn't just wake up one day and say, I don't think white people should use that word. It comes out of this deep cultural context of 600 years. So I think, there's so much that we need to consider. And again, that's where that openness needs to come from. We're never in a vacuum. This is what we're talking about here, is really demonstration of the one body, right? Everything is connected. Everything, the word you were using, Deborah, was interdigitated. Was that what you said? Yeah. But, it's connected, it's interwoven, it's impartial, impossibleness to absolutely pull these things apart. And yet sometimes we have to. And what we might do in our own homes and what we might do in a public context might be very different, and quite appropriately. Okay. Enough hard stuff. Let's do something easy, like vow to save all sentient beings.
Creations are numberless. I vow to free them. Delusions are inexhaustible. I vow to put an end to them. Reality is boundless. I vow to perceive it. The enlightened way is unsurpassable. I vow to embody it. Creations are numberless. I vow to free them. Delusions are inexhaustible. I vow to put an end to them. Reality is boundless. I vow to perceive it. The enlightened way is unsurpassable. I vow to embody it. Creations are numberless. I vow to free them. Delusions are inexhaustible. I vow to put an end to them. Reality is boundless. I vow to perceive it. The enlightened way is unsurpassable. I vow to embody it.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. Have a good week.
Thank
And
you, everyone.
happy spring.
Spring.
Indeed. Thank you.
Thank you.